So it is with great honor to present one of my dear friends, Sarah Bowe. She's a pediatric ENT. I met Sarah a long time ago in the land far away in the Dominican Republic on a medical mission trip. And she has really devoted a lot of her career to looking at gender disparities and gender inequality in medicine. And so we are super, super happy to have her here. This is her first ACI Alliance. I've tried to teach her some of the audiology lingo with ASHA and AAA, so we'll see if she gets it right. Sarah.
Thank you very much. And I really do want to thank the ACIA for letting me speak on this today. So we're going to talk about gender disparities in healthcare, gaps in pay, publication, and promotion. And so I have no financial disclosures, and that is my military disclosure. And so in terms of objectives, we're going to review some key areas in which gender inequities present, specifically relating to pay, publication, and promotion. We'll also talk about CME as well. Can we go back? And so we're also going to talk about definitions in terms of gender and sex. And then finally, I'm going to introduce something called the socio-ecological model, which gives us an opportunity to think about the different levels at which we can do interventions. So we're going to start out with pay in a moment. Oh, sorry, that they're up there and not in front of me. Can we get them in front of me? That's why you guys are all wondering what I was doing up here. I don't have them here at all. So I'm going to glance over this way then. And if we could get them up here, that would be great. And so we'll keep moving on here. I'm glad I just went off what I already knew. So in terms of pay, I would really like to thank the audiology community who had some really fantastic titles as well as figures in a lot of their papers on this topic. And so here's one that's up there, as you can see. So moving on to sex differences in physician salary. So this group of authors looked at over 10,000 physicians in 24 academic medical centers, and they looked at the difference in pay. And you can see they actually adjusted this for a number of confounding variables. So despite the fact that they looked at years since residency, they looked at specialty, they looked at different aspects of both research-based and also clinical productivity. Oh, my slides are cut off in the bottom as well. They still found a difference. The difference is hidden in that black box that's at the bottom. What it is a $20,000 difference that they still found regardless of these adjustments. So really, it was about a 40% difference that was still not accounted for by all of these different variables that are present. And so as we look at this next one, specifically relating to specialty, regarding the surgical specialties, they noted that this was the greatest difference. Again, it's hidden in the black box, but it was about a $34,000 difference that they still noted within the surgical specialties in terms of, again, that adjusted difference in salary. And then when we look at OBGYN and pediatrics, I'm going to comment on this a couple times, but in OBGYN and pediatrics, the faculty representation is actually majority women. And so when we look at that, we still see this gender disparity difference in terms of pay, even in fields in which they are majority women. And so then this looked at, now it's up for me, but it's still cutting off the bottom of your slides. And so then when we look at this, the first one looked at academic medicine. This here is looking at physician compensation more broadly. And so they looked at over 40,000 physicians. And again, they adjusted for a number of variables. And despite this, they noted a $122,000 difference in salary despite adjusting for variables. So again, potentially 28% is what this accounted for in terms of being due to sex discrimination. And so when we look at actually the largest pay gaps, otolaryngology comes in third in terms of the largest pay gaps. And so this other recent article, again, kind of having adjustment for a number of confounding variables, still identified about a 23% pay gap for women compared to men within otolaryngology. When they looked at this across a broad range of academic rankings, they still identified this gap and even increasing amounts of gap as you go further along. And over the course of potentially a 30-year career, this is upwards of $3.3 million difference in salary. And so then when we look at audiology, this is ASHA and the annual salary trends. You can see the numbers there in terms of median calendar year salaries. What I tried to do was I'll put these on the perspective of basically that kind of dollar comparison. So women compared to men make about 86 cents on the dollar, so basically about a 14% gap in terms of pay. It's important to note that these are unadjusted differences, so within the actual survey itself, they don't specifically look at this broken down or including role, so whether you're a director or supervisor, or looking at your degree that you've got, or potentially years in experience or years in practice. So those prior studies that more came out of the otolaryngology and medical literature were those adjusted studies, whereas this is more unadjusted. So then when we look at the AAA, their 2019 compensation benefits report, again, had a very similar finding, so about a 0.86 on the dollar for women compared to men. Again, this is an adjusted difference. Within the 2019 compensation benefits report, they did break down some aspects and basically do a partial adjustment in a way. And so again, we'll kind of focus here on the full-time median pay. But you can see that when you look at the different degrees, that there are differences amongst those in terms of pay gaps for male versus female. And so this actually accounts for about a 30% difference when you look at PhDs in terms of males making about 30% more than females in terms of audiology PhDs. And so this is not necessarily new. This is a 1986 article from the audiology field where they actually did lots of different accounting for multiple variables. So you can kind of see in the highlighted part, they looked at experience, schooling, role, place of employment, marital status, regional concentration, and they still identified about a $10,000 difference in terms of earnings, with males earning more than females. And when they once again kind of did that adjusting, they still figured that about 64% of the earnings differential was potentially due to sex discrimination because it was not accounted for, it was unexplained by all of these other confounding variables. In terms of the ASHA survey, that did have information on gender breakdowns. In terms of the ASHA survey for at least for audiology, for SLP, they did not have gender information in there. And so I wanted to try to give some aspect of the SLP community. And so hopefully I'm saying this right, the CAP CSD, and I'm gonna say that because it's a lot of words if I say it all out. But the 2018 salary survey is here. And so this is broken down again across those academic rankings. And so looking at this kind of in tabular format and again trying to normalize this to the dollar, you can see that female within this CAP CSD survey earned about 94 cents on the dollar compared to males within the survey. There was not as much variation across the different academic ranks as there were in some of the other surveys that we talked about earlier. So that's pay. Now we'll go into publication a little bit, and this really also encompasses research, but it didn't have as much alliteration as pay, publication, and promotion, so I just went with publication. The other thing that you'll notice is I'm a very big fan of social media, and so I absolutely loved this picture when I came across it. Just girls just want to have fun ding. Yeah, I also like puns. So when we look at successful NIH grant funding in otolaryngology, what you see here, and of course I'm having to describe these because like a lot of my information in the bottom of the slides is missing. But what you see here is that the darker bars are males, the lighter bars are females. And this is looking at two different scenarios. One is males in otolaryngology in terms of the amount of money they got for each award that they had. And the one on the right is those individuals taking into account multiple awards that they may have, but basically how much money they had overall. And you can see that across all of the different academic ranks, that for the most part, that females had less funding kind of per grant, as well as kind of for all of their cumulative grants compared to males. This was only statistically significant for assistant professors, but one of the notations that the authors made in the article is certainly there are many less women that get to that professor rank. And so you can see that the error bars there are much larger, meaning that there probably wasn't as much information available, and that basically it might have been underpowered to be able to really identify a difference at that rank. So then when we look at female leadership in high-profile otolaryngology journals, you can see here, this is representation in terms of proportion of females over time with both associate editors and editorial board members. And there is a general increased trend over time. But then when we look at this at a particular time point, so for instance, 2017, the proportion of editorial board members was less than actually the representation of female otolaryngology faculty. So while faculty were about 28%, editorial board members were only about 18%, so disproportionate representation. When we look at it in terms of associate editors, there was a little more parity. To get to an associate editor, presumably you're probably going to be at the associate or full professor rank, and so those were more equal in terms of 20.9 versus 19.5% representation. So this article looked at regional differences in both gender promotion and scholarly productivity. And so I'll talk about the gender promotion part in the next section, but in terms of scholarly productivity, they looked at 4 bibliometrics. So they looked at H-index, they looked at E-factor, which is essentially the H-index corrected for how much time you've been in practice, so kind of a novel metric, as well as publications and publication years. And again, you can see that kind of the darker bars are the males, lighter bars are the females, and all the lighter bars are kind of lower in terms of that scholarly productivity. And this was statistically significant across a large majority of their findings and did have some regional variation. So then kind of looking again kind of at the CSD community, we can potentially kind of take a snapshot of the research doctoral programs. So this is male student enrollment over this 2010 to 2021 time period. And so male student enrollment was about 20% over this time period. But then this potentially can be contrasted against the undergraduate enrollment rate at that time, which is about 5%. And likewise, if you look at ASHA kind of demographics and also the CSD kind of demographics in other surveys, that males represent about 5% of the CSD community. And so, again, we're seeing in some ways kind of disproportionate representation occurring within the research-based kind of doctoral programs. So in terms of promotion, and of course, there's a slide here that has a whole bunch of facial hair categories, which might seem odd. So there are plenty of mustaches, but not enough women. So this actually was a cross-sectional study where they did logistic regression analysis creating a mustache index. Yes. And really this was to create just like a very, very vivid representation of how few women are present in academic medical leadership compared to mustached men. And so you can see here that kind of like one error, that like one line. And so the large majority of specialties, which are to the left-hand side of the screen, actually had less women in leadership across these specialties, across multiple academic medical centers, compared to mustached men. If you see towards the right, pediatrics and OBGYN are included there. Again, they are the specialties that have a majority female representation, so they do have more women that are there. And so in general, they actually had more women compared to the mustached men. I'm clearly taking a while on this slide because I just thought this study was wonderful. But in terms of plastic surgery and general surgery, there are a lot of guys in those fields. Apparently they don't like facial hair. That's the only reason why they ended up all the way to the right-hand side of the slide. So, so this study just kind of, again, kind of points to that really vivid representation of how few women get to these higher level positions in academic medicine. And really, this wasn't unique to academic medicine. In many ways, the authors actually modeled this after a study in business where they looked at CEOs of S&P 1500 companies, and they identified more guys named John and David than all of the women running these companies combined. So again, this kind of really points to that glass ceiling effect, and that gender equality is pretty far away. And so this also kind of gets back again to that glass ceiling or also that leaky pipeline effect that we sometimes hear. You can see here, this is the AAMC survey that is looking at medical school applicants, 51% of which are women, and then that winnowing down to the very small little circles that you see in terms of department chairs and deans. And so again, kind of looking at OBGYN and pediatrics, I mentioned that these were the academic specialties that had a larger percentage of women faculty. So here they're kind of close to or over 60%. But then when we look at them in terms of department chair representation, well, they do have some of the highest rates of representation compared to other specialties. They're sitting at about 28%. So again, that's disproportionate to the percentage that is present within a faculty perspective. And then around the same time in otolaryngology, we had about 28% women, and you can see it's in this like tiny little circle here. But in terms of chairs at that time, 3.5% of our chairs were women. And so this is kind of going back to that same study, and we'll just in some ways kind of focus towards the left side, this overall. But what this is looking at is gender promotion. And so in terms of professor and associate professor and kind of achieving that level of rank. When you look at men in otolaryngology, 60% of them have gotten to professor or associate professor, and this is significantly different than women, where only 40% of them have been able to kind of achieve that level of rank. And so trying to, in some ways, kind of create a comparative picture, again, this is that 2018 salary survey, and so we'll kind of focus here in terms of the faculty. But you can see that in terms of CSD faculty, that about 50% of women have been able to get to that associate professor or professor rank. However, 72% of men have been able to get to that rank. And so again, there's kind of disparity in terms of the proportionate representation of those higher ranks. And then if you kind of look at the lower numbers down there, also in some ways another way to think about this is we've talked kind of roughly about that 5% in terms of representation of males within kind of the CSD fields. That's an average. In SLP, it's around 5%. Audiology, it's around 15%. But really, in some ways, you kind of top out around 15%. But you can see that across each of those increasing academic ranks, that you have more and more representation of men in those higher ranks. So at the full professor level, 41% of your full professors are men in the CSD specialties, although broadly as the field, even if you look at audiology, it's about 15%. So again, kind of looking at that proportionate representation. And so one study, which I'll talk about just a little bit later, by Rogas and Puglia around this same 2018 time period, specifically looked at department chair positions in terms of speech-language pathology and audiology, and identified that about 29% of department chairs were men at that point in time. So again, kind of looking at that in terms of the broader proportionate representation, there's overrepresentation conceivably in terms of department chair leadership, which is very similar to, again, kind of what we have seen in terms of even those fields like OBGYN and pediatrics that have a majority female representation. So that was like a whirlwind of data, which is a lot. But that's really where it starts. We don't actually know what's happening unless we have aspects of data, and ideally we have aspects of good data. And so in terms of kind of this gender disparities journey that we are all on, For some of these, we are much better when it comes to kind of detecting. I think in terms of pay, we have seen this across the board. We have seen it unadjusted, adjusted, every which way you can kind of flip it. And no matter what we do, we still find those disparities. Certainly in some of these other ways, we're starting to see it, but we haven't really dug in as much in terms of that regression analysis, trying to identify what confounding variables are there, and really trying to tease out and understand what is driving these gender disparities. And really only by digging in and understanding can we start to figure out, okay, how do we reduce and ideally eliminate these disparities? And so we need to really kind of do that digging in process to figure out what interventions are going to help us. And so before we kind of go on to that kind of next segment, I want to pause just in terms of definitions. And so in terms of the presented literature that we've looked at so far, we've talked about sex differences and listed both male and female and men and women. We've talked about gender differences and listed both male and female and men and women. And so when it comes to sex and gender, these are not interchangeable. They are entirely different constructs, although we use them interchangeably all the time in our everyday speech and in our written word. And so it was about 20 years ago that in the BMJ that they talked about kind of sex, gender, and health, and really talking about kind of a new approach moving forward. And there's a really great article in The Lancet that goes into this in great detail in terms of sex and gender, and looking at it in terms of modifiers of health, disease, and medicine. And then more recently, in the kind of lower article, the International Journal for Equity and Health, they did a scoping review, again, kind of looking at this both from a medicine perspective and a policy perspective. And really, as much as kind of I said in a lot of the articles that were presented in the earlier part of this talk, that they are very much used interchangeably. And that in many respects, if it kind of leans in one way versus the other, gender usually tends to be picked up. And certainly when we're talking about some of these gender disparities, it in some ways makes sense because really, I don't think relating to our sex as males and females has any bearing on all of the things that we've talked about. These really are all relating to gender. The NIH as well has really focused on this, particularly in their women's health section, but really pulled on the fact that these are different constructs and we need to be talking about them and speaking about them separately. And so gender versus sex, so gender is a socio-political and a cultural construct. And these are actually like the very kind of, these are the definitions from kind of the NIH that you will kind of see on those, that kind of website that I just listed there. But this includes norms, behaviors, and roles that are associated with being a woman or a man. And it interacts with, but it's distinct from sex, which is really the biological and the physiological characteristics of males and females and intersex persons that relates to chromosomes, hormones, and reproductive organs. And so this article that I mentioned kind of just a little bit earlier by Dr. Robin Lindsay, I really appreciated because it takes the time to put into words the terms that she uses in her paper, as well as the definitions. And so really creating that shared language and shared understanding is something that we can all begin to think about as we kind of go forward, whether we're creating studies or kind of writing studies. And I'll talk about that a little more too. And so the socio-ecological model. So Dr. Yuri Bronfenbrenner was a Russian-born American psychologist, and he really created this model starting way back in the 1970s and worked on it essentially for decades. He basically summarized all of his work in this compendium that was written in 2004 and passed away just a year later. And it may seem in some ways kind of very simplistic. You're kind of like looking at this and you're like, okay, yeah, society, community, all of these things are nested in one another. But what it really gets at is that we as individuals every day and kind of every interaction, everything that we do, we're situated within the environment that we're in. And so society is going to have its influences on this community that we have here, our community within our different institutions, the interpersonal interactions that we have, and downstream to us as individuals. And so, it may seem, again, kind of silly to think about that, but on a daily basis, we oftentimes forget the environment that we're in. And those influences that in some ways we almost kind of like become blind to. Fish are in water, but they kind of just forget that they're in water. And so the environment can have a lot of influences on what we do. And so that kind of brings us to really just awareness, which is an initial piece, and kind of recognizing that gender stereotypes, gender bias, gender discrimination, and gender harassment are really all around us. And whether it's unconscious or conscious of it, they are influencing all of our daily interactions. And so this article I thought was great. Of course, it does say how gender stereotypes may limit female faculty advancement, so they got a little minus points for that. But broadly speaking, this was driven directly at the communication sciences and disorders community. And it brings up a lot of really key topics, including role congruity, implicit bias, agentic versus communal traits, and intersectionality. You may or may not recognize a whole lot of those words. We definitely don't have time to go into like every single one of these because you could do hours of lectures on each of them. But I do think that this was a really helpful piece to frame some of the issues that we have kind of both within the CSD communities as well as kind of within otolaryngology. At least within the CSD communities, many of these are influencing actually your representation on kind of who is looking at your fields. And this is what they touched about a lot in terms of that role congruity. But then on the opposite side of kind of that spectrum, you also have, in terms of like women representation in CSD leadership, a decreased representation. And so it's this kind of fine balance or tightrope in terms of bringing more men into the field of CSD, which has been recognized in a lot of papers from your community, as well as still supporting women into those leadership positions. And then within otolaryngology, you know, we have kind of issues in terms of also kind of encouraging women into our field, but then likewise supporting them up through those leadership positions as well. And so we're like these little individuals that are stuck in like this whole crazy milieu of environment. And so sometimes I think that, you know, personally myself, you're like, how on earth do I like change society? Like, that's really difficult. But what we have to recognize is that this is a dynamic relationship, and that Brofenbrenner, he was a psychologist, but he also really appreciated ecology and the fact that these are symbiotic relationships. So society didn't just appear out of nowhere. Society came about from individuals interacting within their communities and creating society, which means that on an individual basis, we actually have a lot of power to make changes. It may be small, but then as we work together and within our communities, we can make those changes. And so what might be some strategies? Well, when it comes to kind of individually, we can be aware of and disrupt our own implicit bias. Interpersonally, we can think about challenging gender stereotypes. We can offer mentorship and sponsorship specifically to predoctoral or medical students to not just foster interest, but also make sure we're supporting the access to the prerequisites in order to succeed. Because the worst is when we potentially foster interest, but we don't give them kind of the necessary pieces to be able to get into the field, to get into those doctoral positions, to do what they want to do. In terms of the community, we can make sure that we're looking at kind of institutional pay summaries and creating opportunities for equitable compensation and recognizing those differences from a gender perspective. And then at the institutional and national level, thinking about data, again, kind of stratified by gender, and looking at those critical transition points that are along the path to career progression. And then I think really from an individual basis, we're in a conference here that is totally focused on the power of hearing. And so I think that it's very fitting to also think about the power of language. And so kind of as we design experiments, survey questions, clinical trials, analyzing data, writing papers, reviewing papers, writing letters of recommendation, we can really choose our words very carefully, and in many cases, better yet, define them. And that is really all I have. Sorry, I was so awkward at the beginning, not knowing where my slides were, but that is what I got for you.
Thank you, Dr. Bowe. That was an amazing talk. Does anyone have any specific questions for her? And in that meantime, I'll have the rest of the panel members come on up.
I have a question. I enjoyed your talk. Nancy Young from Chicago. So in your the data that you gave for salary differences, were there any studies that looked at when these individuals initially, or when they took their jobs, whether they tried to negotiate their offer? Because there's other research in other fields that shows that women may not negotiate and men do, and that can account for part of the salary difference. And that has to do with another gender difference, which is women tend to see the world as more fixed and men tend to see it as more negotiable.
Yeah, none of those in particular really kind of delve into a lot of the kind of potential fixes in a way. There definitely is literature to support that a lot of these disparities just start out literally from like day one, and so therefore they in some ways kind of self-perpetuate on, because at every junction and every stage you're kind of lower. And there, as you kind of mentioned, certainly kind of the negotiating piece is important. And again, kind of the agentic versus communal traits that was kind of mentioned in that other article, there is fairly good support for the fact that changing some of the techniques in terms of negotiation can potentially be more beneficial or harm women. And so sometimes when women try to negotiate for those higher salaries but come at it very forcefully, that they're less likely to get it. Whereas if they potentially kind of even bring up like, oh, well, this is for my family, then they actually tend to be more successful, which is, again, very gendered. But I do think that all of those things, again, that's literally the environment that we're in. It's something that little by little, ideally, we will change and kind of diminish some of these gender stereotypes. But at least for the time being, they are very much present.
I'm Chad. I'm an ENT in Seattle. Thank you very much for this important work. I was very dispirited to learn that women who are surgeons receive a different referral pattern than males. So especially if there's a complication in one of their patients, their referral base will go down. And I'm wondering if you have any suggestions on what women can do to avoid that.
That is a great question, and I do know kind of the study that you're talking about in terms of that women tend to be penalized more for their errors than men are, and that can then have repercussions in terms of all future referrals. I think that in some ways I honestly don't know how easy of a question that is to fix. I mean, I think that it may be depending on kind of that patient and specifically that referring surgeon, maybe, again, even just kind of opening up lines of communication and conversation and pointing out potentially some of the maybe elevated risks for that patient that referring physician might not be aware of, and just having it kind of be an open conversation, because then it potentially removes just some of that potential bias that's present, that's just inherent, and not recognizing kind of the person on the other end of the interaction.
Thank you.
This was very inspiring, so thank you. It was amazing, but also as a medical student, that was kind of a bummer. So do you have any specific advice on how to navigate this? I mean, I know that at my institution, there are amazing champions of women, but that's not necessarily the case at whatever hospital I might be going to. So what do I do?
Yeah, no, I know, and honestly, sometimes you present this data and it is absolutely disheartening. But at the same time, if we don't know that it's there, then we can't try to kind of make efforts to change it. I think that like you mentioned, kind of at each institution there probably is somebody, but also that is where we can create some of these communities at this larger level. And so there may be connections kind of into the specific kind of direction that you want to go at more of like the specialty level or kind of different levels. And so again, that's where there are opportunities at each of those time points points and, or not time points, but each of those kind of larger levels of community. So if you can't find it within your own institution, honestly, just cold email people. When I was like a younger kind of medical student or undergrad, I was totally intimidated about reaching out to people. But the worst that's going to happen is they're not going to email you back. And that's fine. It means no reflection on you. It means they probably got 142 other emails and just missed it. So literally just reach out to people, and you will find people that will respond to you.